Hare Krishna. Today, our journey of self-discovery, we're going to be talking about Part 4, Chapter 2, the 8 features of a bona fide guru. And Prabhupada basically describes this by using the Gurvaṣṭakam prayers. The Gurvaṣṭakam prayers we sing every morning. Samsara dava nalalita loka tranaya karunya gana ganatvam praptasya kalyana gunaravasya vande guru shri charanarvindam. So those are the first one. And he does a little preparation or a preface to this particular description. And we discover that the spiritual master, this is the preface that the BBT devotees put on this chapter. The spiritual master will never say, I am God. The spiritual master will say, I am servant of God. Addressing the student body in Stockholm University in September 1973, Srila Prabhupada delineates the 8 principal features that, according to the Vedic teachings, characterize a genuine spiritual master and thus enable him, or rather enable us, to distinguish the saint from the charlatan. So this is how we can tell a bona fide guru from a fake. Now, our journey of self-discovery, this is the same thing. The spiritual master will never say, I am God. The spiritual master will say, I am servant of God. Addressing the student body of Stockholm University in September 1973, Srila Prabhupada delineates the 8 principal features that, according to Vedic teachings, characterize a genuine spiritual master and thus enable us to distinguish the saint from the charlatan. We read a little bit about this. Just a second. Patiko.
Nice ring.
I cannot do that. I'm giving a class right now. You can, if you want, you can bring stuff in, but I can't come to the front door. I'm in the middle of a class. All right. So back to the world here. So to understand a spiritual master, what a spiritual master is, we can understand the kind of things that the spiritual master does and says. This 8 prayers to the spiritual master is composed by Viśvanātha Cakravartī Ṭhākura. And it describes the qualities and qualifications of the spiritual master. But there is a introduction is the word I'm trying to spit out there, to this particular chapter. So I'll read here very quickly here. In order to enter into spiritual life, 2 things are required as enunciated by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. One needs the mercy of the Supreme Lord and the mercy of the spiritual master. Brahmanda Brahmite Konya Bhagavan Jīva Guru Kṛṣṇa Prasade Pai Bhukti Lata Bij. The living entities are wandering throughout the universe, changing bodies, transmigrating from one body to another, from one place to another, and from one planet to another. Brahmanda Brahmite. They are rotating within this material universe. This science is unknown to modern educators, how the spirit soul is transmigrating from one body to another and how he's being transferred from one planet to another. But we have explained this in our book, Easy Journey to Other Planets. The living entity is trapped in the material world. This is that verse. This comes from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila, chapter 19, 151. Brahmanda Brahmite Konya Bhagavan Jīva Guru Kṛṣṇa Prasade Pai Bhukti Lata Bij. According to their karma, all living entities are wandering throughout the entire universe. Some of them are being elevated to the upper planetary systems, and some are going down to the lower planetary systems. Out of many millions of wandering living entities, one who is very fortunate gets an opportunity to associate with the bona fide spiritual master by the grace of Kṛṣṇa. By the mercy of both Kṛṣṇa and the spiritual master, such a person receives the seed of the creeper of devotional service. We said last week that Brahmanda is a word in Sanskrit that indicates the material universe, and Brahmite means to wander as if not really knowing one's direction. And that's the way the living entities are making progress. They're, in one sense, not making any progress. They're just moving around in a random walk around the material universe. And this is governed by their particular karma. So we have the spiritual sky, which we've discussed before. The Sanskrit term for the spiritual sky is Paravyoma. And in the center of the spiritual sky is the Goloka Vrindavan, the planet that Kṛṣṇa resides in. We see it in the center of this lotus flower. This is the biggest and central planet of the entire spiritual sky. And these planets are bigger than the material universes, so these are very large places. And there Kṛṣṇa carries out his pastimes. The living entities, however, who decide that they are not interested in cooperating with Kṛṣṇa or being a part of his plan, they come to this little dark area that's right below the spiritual sky. That dark area is the material sky. And there in the material world we have all sorts of difficulties. But in the material world we can completely ignore Kṛṣṇa if we want to. To ignore Kṛṣṇa is not possible in the spiritual world, but it is easy in the material world. One can easily ignore Kṛṣṇa. The material world is designed to help us to ignore Kṛṣṇa, and that's why we come here. And this is our problem. We are in the material world trying to ignore Kṛṣṇa. Whenever we engage in the material world, we always think in terms of how to increase our material enjoyment. And this is the default way to live in the material world, to imagine that material enjoyment is the goal and we can get it at every turn, and we should try to get it at every turn, and that is just normal life. Of course, this is completely false, but if we want, we can live like this, and we can go on lifetime after lifetime living like this. But this is, of course, false. And sometime during many countless lifetimes, we run into the devotees or to the spiritual master directly, and the spiritual master changes our mind, or the devotees change our mind and help us to recognize that the material world will never make us happy. Let me ask if anybody has any questions about that so far.
Maharaj?
Yes.
Does Kṛṣṇa, you said that in Goloka, I just want to be clear, that's where he does all of his pastimes?
Yeah.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that he doesn't have pastimes outside of Goloka. He also does, but every pastime that he has in Goloka. That's where his pastimes originate from. Of course, there are a few pastimes which involve, demons and things like that, which can't exist in the spiritual world. So he has to have those in the material world. But basically, The Goloka Vrindavan planet is where Krishna is having round-the-clock pastimes, from so many different types of pastimes and many different types of situations with his intimate devotees in various rasas. So he's having those in Goloka Vrindavan continually. He comes to the material world and he engages in similar pastimes in the material world, but they have a certain difference to them because they're in the material world. And of course, in the material world, here he can fight with demons, which he cannot do in the spiritual world because there are no demons in the spiritual world.
Well, there's plenty of demons here, trust me.
What's that?
I said there's plenty of demons here, trust me.
Yeah. So the material world, there's no shortage of all kinds of inauspicious things. That's the nice benefit we get from this material world. So Prabhupada goes on in this introduction to the glories of the spiritual master. Cynthia, can you see this, or you are able to see it or not? Tell me.
I can see, Maharaj.
Okay, so let me line it up there, and you can read a paragraph or two. Let me go back over to...
Okay.
Okay, so we read that part where it says, in fact, the Guru.
In fact, the Guru can help you transmigrate from this planet directly to the spiritual sky, Pitṛloka, where there are innumerable spiritual planets. The topmost planet in the spiritual sky is Krishna's planet, called Goloka Vrindavan. The Krishna consciousness movement is trying to give information of how one can be transferred directly to the Goloka Vrindavan planet, Krishna-loka. That is our mission. What is the difference between this material world and the spiritual world? The difference is that in the material world, you have to change your...
Just a second, let me scroll down here. I gotta get back over here.
The difference is that in the material world, you have to change your body, although you are eternal. Ajyo nitya sasvato yam purano na hanyate hanyat yamane sarire. Bhagavad Gita 2:20. You are not destroyed after the annihilation of your material body, but you transmigrate to another body, which may be one of 8,400,000 forms. Jalaja Navalaksani. There are 900,000 forms in the water, 2 million forms of trees and planets, 1,100,000 forms of insects, 1 million forms of birds, and 3 million forms of the beasts. Then you come to this human form of life. Now it is your choice whether to be transferred again by the cycle of transmigration from one body to another in the lower species of life, or whether to be transferred to the spiritual sky, to the highest spiritual planet, known as Goloka Vrindavan. That is your choice. You have been given the chance of this human form of body to make your choice. In the lower species, you are completely under the control of material nature. But when the material nature gives you a chance to get this human form of body, you can choose whatever you like. That is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita 9.25. Yanti Deva Vritratna Devan Pitṛnyanti Pitur Bhutani Yanti Vaitijana Yanti Madhyano Piyamam. Those who are trying to be elevated to the higher planets, Devaloka, or the planets of the demigods, where the standard living and the lifespan are very great, may worship the demigods. Or if you want, you may be transferred to Pitṛloka, or to the planets of the ghosts, or to the planet where Krishna lives. Yanti Madhyano Pimam. This all depends on your activities, but samsara, rotating, wandering within this material world from one body to another, or from one planet to another, is not advised. Material existence is called samsara. Bhuvata bhuvata praliyatu. Bhagavad Gita 8:19. You take your birth in some form of body. You live for some time, and then you have to give up this body. Then you have to accept another body, again live for some time, then give up that body, and then again accept another body. This is called samsara.
Okay, that's good. You can stop there. So we have these various themes that Prabhupada is bringing bringing before us. We are discussing the idea of going from one lifetime to another. So, na jayate mriyate vakadachin nayam vabhavata vana bhuya ajotnitya sashvato yam purano nahanyate hanyamane sharire. For the soul there is never birth or death. At any time he does not come into being. He does not come into being. He has not come into being. He does not come into being. And he will not come into being. He is unborn, eternal, ever existing and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. This is that verse that Prabhupada has quoted, 220, in the earlier part of what Cynthia just read. So we had, yeah.
Okay, I have a question, but please let me know if it's a good time to ask, or I can wait.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask about this, but it also I was listening to yesterday's lecture in the Russian class, but I didn't, I just wasn't able to follow. And then when Cynthia was reading the passage, it was there was one mention about Pitṛloka.
At what?
So Pitṛloka?
Yeah, Pitṛloka, right.
Yeah, and so I was just curious because I wasn't able to really get what was that realm or planet really about, because is it how is it different from the other heavenly planets that one could go into? I was just kind of curious because I heard from yesterday's lecture that the souls just they could either be punished or they might reside in Pitṛloka for some time, and I wasn't sure how that's differentiated from the other heavenly realms. But
yeah.
Wondering if you could clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, the universal planetary system is divided into three great sections, and so there are what we call the upper planetary systems, or the heavenly planets. They're the middle planetary systems, and then there's the lower planetary systems. And there are 7 upper planetary systems, which are various heavenly worlds: Maharlok, Janalok, Tapalok, Satyalok, etc. There are names like that. And then there are 7 lower planetary systems: Atala, Sutala, Vitala, Talatala, Mahatala, Rasatala, etc. These are the lower planetary systems. But these are not hellish worlds. These are actually like the heavenly worlds. They are very opulent, but they are not populated by demigods. They're populated instead by those who are demoniac and their assistants, the Daityas and Danavas. They live down there. And just above the Garbhodak Ocean, which is the bottom of the universe, half the universe is filled with water, and that's the Garbhodana water. Just above that waterline, there is Pitṛloka, and then there is Narakaloka, which is hell. The hellish worlds are where people have to suffer for the wrongs they have committed in this lifetime. That's what the hellish worlds are. And Yamaraj, who administers the justice of assigning people to various kinds of hellish existence for their misdeeds, he lives in Pitṛloka. And as well, in Pitṛloka, that's where various ancestors reside, those who are being glorified and continually worshipped by their descendants here in the earth plane. Because as soon as the descendants here in the earth plane stop worshiping the ancestors, they can no longer stay there in Pitṛloka. So Pitṛloka is like a heavenly planet, but it's located differently. It's located in a different place. And the manes, or the ancestors, especially those who are kings, they usually wind up residing there. And as long as the descendants of those kings, their lineage is performing certain types of activities, certain kinds of pujas, they can stay there. But as soon as the ancestors' descendants stop performing those sacrifices, then they have to leave. They will be forced back into the material world. Generally speaking, the people in Pitṛloka, I think, are not sinful. But at any rate, the idea is that this is kind of a separate place where sinful people reside. And we see that there is places for everybody. In the Gayatri mantra, the first line is Om Bhur Bhava Swar Tat Sarvator Varenyam. So the Bhuvarloka is the earth plane. Bhuvarloka is just off the earth plane, where it's just a little bit above the earth plane. And that is the abode of various ghosts and spirits, because Prabhupada mentions, you can go to the planet of the ghosts. That's where it is. It's just above the earth plane, kind of in the ether, in the air there. So that's where the ghosts reside. And then above that is Swarg, or Svargaloka, which is the heavenly planes. And again, we talked already about the Bilaswarga, which is where the lower planetary systems are, and that's where the demons and Danavas reside. So that's a quick, sort of synopsis of the location and categorization of how the material earthly planets are arranged. They are not necessarily, those directions, upper and lower, are not necessarily our visible north. If we consider the equator to be like the plane, then a normal going north would not be necessarily what we mean by above, and a normal going south would not mean necessarily the other direction. We cannot see these. These are another categorization, and therefore we don't see the places where some of these things happen. We don't see the Bila Swarga. We do see the planets who are heavenly planets. Those appear to be the planets that are actually visible to our astronomy. The sun planet is a heavenly planet. We don't see Maharlok, Janalok, Tapalok. We don't see those. But we do see some of the other planetary systems, which are somewhat heavenly, and some are sort of neither here nor there. So we have a lot of different things. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay.
I was just wondering, for the ancestors that are in the Pitṛloka, I'm assuming that the pujas, they have to be done very precisely, right? It's not just people these days that we know, when they depart, there's some remembrance, but I'm thinking these pujas, they're very consistent and consistently performed and very precise.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, there's a science to it.
yeah.
As we mentioned yesterday, that in India and also in the Orient, in China, Japan, the worship of the ancestors is quite important in those cultures. And therefore, people who are descending from various lines, they make a very distinct and careful effort to preserve the worship of their ancestors, especially in Japan. This is a big thing. Of course, in China as well, they have all these ceremonies and services for offering. In India, in the Garuda Purana, there are details for exactly how these various worships should be carried out. And there is a whole list of various kinds of things that have to be done. And of course, in India, we know this as the offering of pinda to the ancestors, which is done usually once a year by the eldest male member of the family. They go there, and there's a set ritual. The pandas or the pandits, they arrange for it. They know the mantras and everything, and one buys some fruits and various other things and goes through a ceremony, and then one is considered to have worshipped the ancestors. Now, there's another similar kind of thing that has to be done for those who are departed who are very sinful, and this saves them from being tortured as much. They're still going to be tortured when they're ripped out of their gross material body by the Yamadutas and taken to the abode of Yamaraj, because the Pitṛloka plane is far away from the earth plane. So one has to go through a very torturous journey to get there, and there's nothing to eat or drink. But if the relatives of the departed sinful ancestor do some various kinds of also presentations of various kinds, there's a kind of ball made of rice and chickpea flour or something like that, I think. And if this is done, then the ancestor has something to eat on his way to being judged by Yamaraj. Otherwise, he has nothing to eat. And similarly, there's things for him to drink, etc. So these are ceremonies that are carried out for not illustrious ancestors, but for kind of ancestors who didn't leave their body in such a good state of consciousness. So therefore, the relatives, the living relatives, try to help them in that way. So both of those are there.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay. So we see that this universe is a grand scheme. The material domain is a huge grand scheme with many material universes in it. And even our one material universe is still in itself very intricate. And there are many compartments and places where the living entity can wind up as a result of particular karma. It takes a particular kind of karma to wind up as a ghost. It takes a particular kind of karma to enter the heavenly planets. It takes a very specific kind of karma to enter the highest heavenly planets like Satyalok and Brahmalok. And then it takes a special kind of karma to enter the subterranean heavenly worlds where the Daityas live. And it takes a certain kind of karma to enter Pitṛloka. Each one of these things has a specific karma associated with it. And most just wind up coming back to the earth plane. But you may not come back to the earth plane as a human being. And this is, as we were just reading, this idea here was being put forward by Prabhupada. And he said, what Cynthia read, what is the difference between the material world and the spiritual world? The difference is, it's a material world, you have to change your body, although you are eternal. So then Prabhupada quoted this verse, Bhagavad Gita 2:20, Ajonitya shashvato yam purano nahanyate hanyamane sharire. And this particular verse comes from, as we see, Bhagavad Gita, the second chapter, the 20th verse. The soul doesn't die, and the soul has always existed. This is what this means, Najayate, that means he doesn't, he has not come into existence. Namriyate, he's not born, he's not died, he doesn't die, Kadachin, at any time. and he will not come, he will not be born or die at any time, and he has not been born or die at any time. The soul is eternal, which is sometimes hard for us to grasp in this modern way of thinking about things. We are so conditioned to think that everything has a beginning and an end, and indeed in the material world things do have a beginning and an end, but in the spiritual world that's not true. Everything exists forever. So the soul is not created, and the soul will never be extinguished. However, the soul will go through transformations depending on karma, and in the material world, certainly you cannot escape the disjunction of the soul and the gross material body. Those two things will be separated at one point. And then if one has lived sinfully, the next likely thing to happen is that one will take birth in one of the animal species, and that is not a good thing. We have to go through so many different kinds of difficulties when that takes place. So as Cynthia was reading, there's 8,400,000 forms of life. There's 400,000 human forms, 900,000 aquatics in the sea, and other bodies of water. There are 2 million plant forms. There are 1,100,000 insect forms. And then we have 1 million bird forms, as well as 3 million types of beasts of various kinds, land animals of one form or another. This means that those who fail to use the abilities or the capacity of a human body to try to understand spiritual life and actually engage in it, such people will certainly be reduced to an animal form. And as a result of being reduced to an animal form, they will have to gradually climb back up to the human form of life. The farther down you fall, the more steps you have to go through to get back to the human form of life. We see here that actually aquatics are kind of at the bottom, and then we have plants and insects and so on and so forth. So to climb back up the ladder is something that takes a long time. We have to go through all kinds of births, because each time we die, we get promoted just one notch up. That's all. We don't get promoted 2 notches up or 3 notches up. We just get promoted one notch up to the next highest type of evolved species of life. So it usually is not human. And so if you fall all the way down, you have to go through, 8 million forms before you come back to a humanoid form. Yeah.
No, I thought you froze for a moment there. I wasn't hearing anything for a moment.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like a few, maybe 30 seconds or something.
Yeah, I have internet issues here. The internet comes and goes, so sometimes I freeze. That's because the internet has decided it's
Get a
not going to
sweater.
function. Okay.
Get a sweater, Maharaj.
It's a time freeze, so maybe instead of a sweater, I need to get some kind of scooter or something like that, so I can keep moving. All right, so we've talked now about these 8,400,000 forms of life. As we said, 400,000 forms are humanoid. Some of them are human, some are lower aspects of human life, and some are higher than human. But in all cases, the 400,000 forms at the top here are those who have the capacity to actually understand spiritual life and or accept it or reject it. They can accept it or they can reject it. That's the specific capability of humans. Any questions about that so far?
Maharaj, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, you mentioned that demons, they live in the lower planetary systems.
Yeah.
And why there are so many demons right here in the earth? And
Well,
why there are so many ghosts also? If they belong to another planet, why do they have to be here? Have their own planet. Why are they crowding planet Earth?
we talked about that a little bit yesterday too, or maybe it was a week ago. I don't remember. The idea is that the Daityas, they don't have to stay there. They're powerful enough that they can travel, just like the demigods don't have to stay in the heavenly planets. They can travel. They can come here at will, and they don't even have to use a corona mask or anything like that. They don't have to deal with the people at the customs or anything like that. They can just come, and they can walk among us, and we would never know. Same thing with the demons. The ghosts, of course, they're in a situation where they're not visible to us. We are visible to them, but they are not visible to us under usual circumstances. So they have a reason for coming here too. Generally speaking, ghosts are they delight in creating problems for people in a human form of life, that have a material body. They once had a material body, but they lost it due to some kind of sinful act, and now for some time they have to abide without having material body. Eventually they will get another material body. They'll be reassigned one, but for some time they have to live without one, and so they are bored, and they are also ignorant, and they're also very passionate. So the only thing they can find to do with their time is to cause mischief for those in the physical bodies like we have. They want to take over those bodies, or at least they want to cause trouble to them. And the demons, they come here for another reason. We discussed that the earth plane is a place that's in between. As we said, it's a middle planet. It's in between the heavenly planets and the subterranean heavenly planets and the hellish worlds and all that. So it's in between. The reason the demons come here is so that they can have a foothold, a strategic stronghold to attack the heavenly worlds, which is what they're interested in. They're not interested in this world, in the earth world. They're not interested very much in the people here or the earth world itself. It's, as I was using the analogy last time I spoke, either a couple of days ago or a week ago, I don't remember, that it's like the Second World War, where the United States military wanted to attack Japan, so they had to set up installations on various Pacific islands that were somewhere in between Japan and the United States, so they would have less travel time to be able to attack Japan. So in a similar way, the demons are doing the same thing. And as I said before, during Kṛṣṇa's time, they were really serious about an attack on the heavenly world. So they had heavily infiltrated the earth plane. And as a result, the demigods were disturbed by this, and Earth herself, she was disturbed by this. So she made a plea to Brahma, and Kṛṣṇa agreed to come to the earth and to get rid of them, which he did. But that was 5,000 years ago. He got rid of them at that point. He came and he forced them all to leave. But since then, they've started to come back. So that's why there's so many of them here. Again, they're interested in trying to launch some kind of strategic attack against the heavenly worlds, and that's why they're here. And just like the demigods, who can change their form and walk among us undetected, so the demons can also change their form and walk among us undetected, and they won't seem at all different. But they still have powers way beyond ours, so they can live for a long time, and so on and so forth.
Maharaj.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah.
just actually like something came to mind, like when you were describing that. How did the ghosts, like, you know, how did those, you know,
Uh-oh.
how do they?
I missed your question because either I faded or you faded. I don't know. I got
Sorry.
pieces.
So how it sounds like the ghosts are just kind of like lost souls or something, like they somehow escaped, you know, Yamraj's, like, you know, grasp or like judgment. Like I mean, how did, like, because it's, I feel like when someone is like living as a ghost, like a soul is you know, in that state,
Yeah. There's several reasons why a person becomes a ghost. And those are described in the Garuda Puran. The Garuda Purana does a lot of description of hell, heaven, the places in between, how one goes to hell, how one gets out of hell, how one becomes a ghost, how one gets liberated from being a ghost. All these kind of things are described in the Garuda Puran. Essentially, a person becomes a ghost when they commit suicide. You know, when you get rid of your own gross material body, out of your own desire, you commit suicide. As a result, you get rid of your own material body. As a punishment, you don't get one for a while. You're forced to live as a ghost. And as we said some time ago, at least at certain previous lectures I've given, I've talked about the fact that a subtle body is basically what a ghost is. We have a gross body, and we're inside the gross body is a subtle body, and inside the subtle body is the soul itself. So there's two layers or two coverings. When we die, the gross body certainly disintegrates, but the vehicle that takes the soul to a new gross body is a subtle body. And therefore, the subtle body is that form of mind, intelligence, and false ego, or we could say false mind, false intelligence, and false ego. And that construction of those three things is what takes the soul itself to a new gross body. But when, as a result of being sinful, one does not get a new gross body, then one is just doomed to stay as a ghost for some time, and it may be thousands of years. Another reason why a person becomes a ghost, it describes in the Garuda Purana, is that the agents of Yamaraj, when they take people from their gross body at death and they're transporting them to the planet of Yamaraj, to Yamaloka, where Yamaraj judges people. Sometimes people escape, just like we have criminals that escape in the modern system, that for one reason or another, there's too many of them at one time and somebody's not watching, they escape. And if they escape, they know that they are probably going to be sentenced to go through some kind of hell, so they don't want to go back. However, if you don't report back to the agents of Yamaraj and go through the process of being judged, the fault or the difficulty there is that you also are not promoted on the cycle of birth and death. You continue to remain a ghost until, one day you go and meet the Yamadutas and turn yourself in, and then you go through being judged by Yamaraj and maybe have to go to hell for some time, and then you can be reincarnated. So that's another reason why sometimes people become ghosts. Sometimes when people are very powerful as, brahmanas, but they're very, malevolent in their consciousness, they use their Brahminical knowledge in a wrong way, they become Brahma Rakshasa ghosts, who are the worst kind of ghosts. They're the most intense kind of ghosts. And they stay that way for a long time until, somehow or other they are promoted again to the cycle of birth and death to have another gross body again. And then another reason why people become ghosts is because they're very sinful, and they die suddenly and unexpectedly, and then they become ghosts for some time. So all these different kinds of scenarios lead to an individual being placed in the category of being a ghost or just a subtle body with no gross body. And that may be for some short time, or it may be for a long time, depending on the circumstances of how they came to be there. Yeah, usually that's the way it works. But occasionally, because they're sinful in a very particular way, I don't remember what the kind of sins it takes that you wind up being a ghost. But if you die suddenly, you can become a ghost. If you are very sinful and you gradually die as a result of getting old and so forth, then you certainly go through the regular process. But if, as a result of being sinful, you anger somebody and they murder you or something like that, then on top of everything else you have to go through, you have to be a ghost for some time. So you don't get promoted. You just remain a ghost for some while. And so this is another thing that can happen. These are, there's a lot of these details. The cycle of reincarnation, in an overview, is fairly simple, but when you start getting down into the weeds of the details of what can happen as a result of certain kinds of things, then you can see that there's a lot of different possibilities that could be taking place.
Thank you, Maharaj. That's
Okay.
pretty mind-boggling.
Okay. So we'll go a little bit further into this group of paragraphs that were read by Cynthia. As we've been discussing here, we have, the spiritual world, and in between the spiritual world is something called the Brahma Jyoti, and in the material world, we have also divisions we've been talking about. So Prabhupada describes Goloka Vrindavan being the highest planetary system. And in this image, we see that at the very top is Goloka Vrindavan. That's where Kṛṣṇa stays, and that's where he carries out his pastimes. And below that, we have a region called Mathura and another region called Dwarka, where Kṛṣṇa carries out different pastimes than he does in Goloka Vrindavan. In Goloka Vrindavan, it's for his childhood pastimes and his pastimes with the gopis. That's Goloka Vrindavan. But Mathura is for pastimes where he is much more involved as a king there, and different pastimes happen there. And in Dwarka, that's where his pastimes are with his queens. Of course, the Brahma Jyoti is just a homogeneous white, energy. There's no variety or anything there, so that's why I've divided it into three sections: some Brahma Jyoti, more Brahma Jyoti, and the lower Brahma Jyoti. They all look exactly alike because that's the way the Brahma Jyoti is. There's no real divisions there. And then in the material world, we have, of course, the upper planets, the middle planets, and the lower planets. We just talked about them. So this is our kind of another visual map to help us grasp this whole setup, how the material and spiritual worlds are laid out. And as Cynthia was finishing up, Prabhupada began to describe this idea here of material nature gives you a kind of body, and according to your thinking and according to your karma, this is what kind of body you get. So some are trying to go to Devaloka, which is where the heavenly planets are. Some want to go to the Pitṛloka, where the Pitris are, and others want to go to other places. And that's this verse that's described here. Now, here the verse is in Bhagavad Gita. Yanti deva vrata devan pitrin yanti pitri vrataha bhutani yanti bhutejya yanti mad yajino pimam. Those who worship demigods will take birth among the demigods. Those who worship ancestors go to the ancestors. Those who worship ghosts and spirits will take birth among such beings. And those who worship me will live with me. Now here we see another way you become a ghost. If you worship ghosts, you become a ghost. So there's another avenue for how you wind up in that unfortunate situation of being a ghost. Any questions about that?
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Yeah, Gail.
Yeah, why would anybody want to worship a ghost?
Well, actually, this is quite common on the earth. You know, maybe not so much in modern contemporary suburbia, although I'm sure it even happens there. But in Africa, people worship ghosts. In India, people worship ghosts. Oftentimes, there's a whole story about Bhaktivinoda Thakur learning about some dacoits who were worshiping some ghost in a tree, and he went there and performed some yajna or some chanting, and the ghost had to leave the tree, and the dacoits had nowhere to get their power from. Often the idea of worshiping ghosts is that you get some power from the ghosts. And as a result, this is kind of what we in the Western world call black magic, where people want to have some power over other people, and they get that by worshiping various disincarnate beings. And the left-handed path is full of this kind of thing, where you worship various demoniac and disembodied living entities, unfortunate living entities. So, you know, this is called the Agora Panta. The Agoris, or the left-handed path. Sometimes it's also called Tantra. People who engage in this kind of activities are quite commonly they worship ghosts and demoniac entities. And by doing so, they get various material powers that they wouldn't have. They can, live without, for a longer time than they normally would. They may be able to read minds or control minds to some extent. They may be able to cause havoc in somebody else's life. This is the kind of thing that happens especially a lot in India, where people try to harness these darker forces for their own doing. And the same thing happens, we know, when we talk about voodoo and some of these other kind of activities, where people are essentially worshiping discarnate beings or demoniac beings. And as a result, a good chance that after they leave their body, they will wind up becoming a ghost because of it. There's a lot of bizarre things going on this planet. If you really kind of make an effort to look around and survey various cultures, you'll see that a lot of very strange things go on in certain cultures. Since I've come in contact with Caribbean culture, I know that the Caribbeans do some pretty wild things. At least some of them do. In the various, North American tribes did very strange things at different times. In South America, also, we have, in India, so many different kinds of worship. The Kapalikas, or the skull men, who travel around and they drink and eat from a human skull that's been severed, so that they use it like a bowl. And they have a notorious, sort of history and culture that is known in India quite well from one side to another. So there's all these kind of strange groups of people who are communicating or communing with various kinds of beings that are non-physical to some extent. Or in some cases, they may be physical. You have elves and fairies in the British Isles, and you have other kinds of things going on. All these different kinds of beings have their existence and sometimes interact with our modern world, even though scientific types are completely sure that such things could not exist. They do, in fact, exist. That's not to say that some people imagine them to exist when they actually don't, but they do exist as a category.
Hi, Kṛṣṇa. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was having trouble unmuting before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it seems that I don't know, like when you mentioned drinking out of a skull, I just can't imagine, why a person would want to do these things, aside from wanting to harness power to, harm other people, for your selfish purposes. But other than that, I just kind of can't relate, I guess.
Yeah. Well, people are selfish, and when they're not connected with any kind of spiritual life, they become more and more selfish. And of course, many of them have no faith in the supernatural, so they just become kind of slaves to some kind of material solutions to get their material desires fulfilled. But there are few who are already, to some extent, open to the supernatural. So naturally, they understand that in the world, not very many people are aware of the supernatural. So certainly, they use this as a tool to fulfill their material desires. This is the way that the material world works. If you're not interested in spiritual life, then you're interested in material life. And you're interested in material life, you're interested in material gratification. And if you're interested in material gratification, often you become more and more committed to material gratification. And therefore, you become gradually committed to darker and darker forms of material gratification until, essentially not much can stand in your way. You're serious enough about gratification that you're willing to do anything for it, including kill or steal or lie, or if you have those abilities to cultivate mystic powers according to a certain regime that is known kind of, it's a not well-known regime, but in most parts of the world, there are those who do know the black arts of how to harness various kinds of malevolent forces to, further your own material ambitions in various ways. And so this is the kind of thing that goes on. In our, modern culture, people don't believe in this so much, but it's still possible. And in most of the older cultures of the world, there's a whole system of how to harness these darker powers. And there's different darker powers you can harness, and therefore the systems are a little bit different. But people use that because they want to fulfill their material desires. They're not interested in approaching God. They're not interested in doing something spiritual. They want to get what they want through some dark energy, and that's why these things are fascinating for some people. They see them as just a tool to get whatever material ambitions they're interested in fulfilled.
Yes, thank you, Maharaj.
Okay, so we were discussing this this thing here that one worships different things to go to different destinations. So that was our from our journey of self-discovery, and then that led us to the Bhagavad Gita. And then later on, Prabhupada went a little further here, and he discussed this idea here that bhutva bhutva praliyate. The cycle of birth and death is called samsara, and it happens again and again. And Kṛṣṇa describes it here in the 8th chapter, 19th verse in Bhagavad Gita, bhutva bhutva praliyate. And here is that verse in Bhagavad Gita. Bhutva gramas evayam bhutva bhutva praliyate ratriyagame visha partha prabhavanti agar agame. Again and again, when Brahma's day arrives, all living entities come into being, and with the arrival of Brahma's night, they are helplessly annihilated. Brahma creates the material world when he wakes up in the morning. So just imagine, instead of just having to brush your teeth and get your clothes ready and, take a shower, you had to create the whole material universe when you got up in the morning. That's what Brahma has to do. He has to create the entire material universe. And when he does that, then as he's created it, then living beings gradually can come out from the body of Garbha Vishnu, and then begin to populate the material universe and take their positions, some in higher planes, some in lower planes, some in animal bodies, and some in various other kinds of bodies. So this is the nature of the material world. Every day of Brahma is an enormously long time. It's called a kalpa. And a kalpa, or Brahma's day, is 1,000 times the composite of all four yugas. So we have the Satya Yuga, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali Yuga. And when we add all three of those together, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali, that's called a Divya Yuga. So it's 1,000 of those that have to go by before Brahma's day ends. And then a similar period of time is Brahma's night. And it's just as long as Brahma's day, except that at Brahma's night, there's nothing going on. No living entities are wiggling around in the material world anywhere. They're all nicely snoozing. So they are inert. And then when Brahma wakes up, he starts to energize the material universe again, and the material planets, the lower planetary systems and the middle planetary systems, they get taken out from the waters, and once again they get populated with living beings, and everything kicks off and starts going again until the end of Brahma's day. After 1,000 revolutions of all four yuga cycles, then we go through the whole thing again. This allows living entities to have countless births in all kinds of species, lower and higher. It gives us a chance to enjoy the material world in various kinds of material situations, sometimes as a king, sometimes as a pauper, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman, sometimes as a very powerful or popular person, sometimes as someone who is sickly and nobody knows about them, sometimes with a long life, sometimes with a short life. And again, sometimes as an insect, sometimes as a tree, sometimes as a human being, sometimes as a demigod, etc., etc. So we get the chance to go through all these experiences. It goes over and over again. And that keeps going until the end of Brahma's day. And then at the end of Brahma's day, there's a partial annihilation, and all the living entities then have to sleep in the body of Garbha Vishnu for a period of time. And when Brahma wakes up again, then they come out again and do their little dance and wiggle around again. So that's the way it works. Any questions about that? So all this that we're talking about here is the prelude that Prabhupada gives us before he begins to describe the spiritual master. And of course, as we said, we're doing this, lifetime after lifetime, day of Brahma after day of Brahma. So for eons and eons and eons, we're going through all this ridiculous stuff, sometimes in one form, sometimes as another. And at some point, we run across the spiritual master. And when that happens, when that finally happens, he liberates us. And so therefore, in the morning, we sing the 8 verses which describe the glories of the spiritual master, and that's what we're moving into next. Let me find someone else to read here. Gail, can you see this, or you can't see it? Let me pop it up here. You're able to read that, or it's not possible for you?
Yeah, I had to get off my laptop, so I'm only using my phone. So I can't see the screen just yet.
Okay.
I'm trying to get back.
Maybe then I'll let somebody else read. Laja Sheila, can you read it or see it? I think she disappeared. Let's go with Ken then. Maybe Ken can read it.
I can see everything except the top right corner because I have my little picture-in-a-picture thing going on.
Okay, so I'll lower
Yeah.
it down a bit here.
Okay.
We read this already about various planets. Let's go here. Where the material world is compared to Davanala. You can see that?
If you can just bring it in one more line.
One more line. Up or down?
Down. Lower.
That's good
Yep.
enough?
Yeah. The material world is compared to Davanala, a forest fire. As we, I can't see the end of it, experience, no one goes to the forest to set a fire, but it takes,
Right.
I can't read the, it's cut
Okay,
off.
let me shrink it a bit. We'll see if that makes any difference. Let me know if this helps. Position. Zoom. Y. No, wrong thing. Reset. Zoom X is what we want. Does that help any or not?
I can just see the first. Still, it takes something P.
Takes place, yeah. You get that's
Takes place, yeah.
That's cut off for you.
Yeah.
What happens if you hold your phone the other direction?
It's the same.
It's the same. So
Yeah.
somehow or another, it's just, and even if I
It just cut off there.
crunch it
Yeah.
even more, it doesn't help.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's good now.
Now
Well,
you can see it?
Crunch a little bit more.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. The material world is compared to Davanala, a forest fire. As we have experienced, no one goes to the forest to set a fire, but still it takes place. Similarly, no one within this material world wants to be unhappy. Everyone is trying to be happy, but one is forced to accept unhappiness. In this material world, from time immemorial to the present moment, a little too much. There have been occasional wars, world wars, even though people have devised various means to stop wars. When I was a young man, there was the League of Nations. In 1920, after the First World War, different nations formed the League of Nations just to arrange for peaceful living among themselves. No one wanted war, but again there was a forest fire, the Second World War. Now they have devised the United Nations, but war is still going on. The Vietnam War, the Pakistan War, and many others. So you may try your best to live peacefully, but nature will not allow you. There must be war. And this warlike feeling is always going on, not only between nation and nation, but also between man and man, neighbor and neighbor, even between husband and wife and father and son. This warlike feeling is going on. This is called Davanala, a forest fire. No one goes to the forest to set fire, but automatically, by the friction of dried bamboo, sparks arise, and the forest catches fire. Similarly, although we do not want unhappiness, by our dealings we create enemies, and there is fighting and war. This is called Samsara Davanala.
Okay, let's stop there. The idea here is that we are talking about the material world, and Prabhupada highlights this first verse of the Gurvaṣṭakam, which is, as we said, written by Viśvanātha Cakravartī Ṭhākura. Samsara davanala loka tranaya karunya gunaganatvam praptasya kalyana gunarnavasya vande guru shri charanarvindam. The spiritual master is receiving benediction from the ocean of mercy, just as a cloud pours water on a forest fire to extinguish it. So the spiritual master delivers the materially afflicted world by extinguishing the blazing fire of material existence. I offer my respectful obeisances unto the lotus feet of such a spiritual master who is an ocean of auspicious qualities. And Davanala is the forest fire that Prabhupada is talking about here. The material world is like a forest fire, and of course, his example that he uses to illustrate the forest fire is the First and Second World Wars. They were like a forest fire. Nobody really wanted them, but they happened. And as a result of both of these wars, many, many, many people suffered in very terrible ways. That's the nature of the material world, that it creates these settings. And there's not much anybody can do about them. They happen because the population of the Earth planet is impious. They're sinful. And to give them the negative results of their sin, they have to engage in some kind of suffering. And in this case, that suffering is caused by a war, a First World War and the Second World War. People thought the First World War was going to be so bad that it would be called the war to end all wars. But then we had the Second World War, which was even worse. And many, many, many people died in these conflicts. The living entities, they are swept up in this karma, and they suffer. But the spiritual master is described as rain, like a gentle, gentle rain. Prabhupada will talk about that in a minute. In this particular chapter, he'll describe how rain can come and dampen the fire to where the fire goes out. The spiritual master then tells us who we really are and what we really should be doing. And just like a doctor, we have some problem. We don't have any clue of what that problem is, nor do we certainly have any clue of what kind of medicine it would take to fix the problem. But we go to a doctor and he tells us, oh, your problem is this. You have some kind of issue. You have hepatitis, or you have some kind of other medical issue. And I have the remedy. You should do this. We'll prescribe this kind of medication. And if you follow the doctor's direction, then you would never have understood even what your problem was, what to speak of what the medication that would fix it would be. But the doctor knows. And because you follow the advice of the doctor, then you discover that you are gradually becoming free from your disease. The disease is fading away if you have a good doctor. Any questions about that? There will be altogether 8 verses, and there, as we said, those 8 verses that we sing in the morning. So Prabhupada gave us this introduction where he described the living entities wandering, and then how the spiritual master is the person who delivers them. And now we're talking about the spiritual master. So we describe this first first stanza of the Gurvaṣṭakam, and it talks about the spiritual master getting benediction. It talks about the spiritual master being like a forest, like a cloud pouring water on a forest fire, and that the spiritual master is like an ocean of mercy himself. So, any questions or discussion about that?
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
If
I go to the book, can you just tell me which section I should be looking in? I'm looking in the contents.
Oh, I see. We are, let me back this up here. We're in part 4, chapter 2, the bona fide spiritual master. That's the name of the chapter. You can.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So we'll go back here to where we were before. Any questions about the blazing fire? If not, then we'll go on to the next segment. And Gail, you've got the book in front of you now, right? Have you discovered?
Yeah, and I can also see this. I can also see the screen now.
Oh, okay. So if you can start where it says the forest fire of material existence at the very bottom, I'll start to.
Okay. Yeah, that's where I should start.
Right, forest fire.
Okay. The forest fire of material existence goes on perpetually, and the authorized person who can deliver you from this fire is called Guru, the spiritual master. How does he deliver you? What is the means? Consider the same example. When there is a fire in the forest, you cannot send a fire brigade or go there yourself with bucketfuls of water to extinguish it. That is not possible. Then how will it be extinguished? You need water to extinguish fire, but where will the water come from? From your bucket or your fire brigade? No, it must come from the sky. Only when there are torrents of rain from the sky will the blazing forest fire be extinguished. These rains from the sky do not depend on your scientific propaganda or manipulation. They depend on the mercy of the Supreme Lord. So the spiritual master is compared to a cloud. Just as there are torrents of rain from a cloud, so the spiritual master brings mercy from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. A cloud takes water from the sea. It doesn't have its own water, but takes water from the sea. Similarly, the spiritual master brings mercy from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Just see the comparison. He has no mercy of his own, but he carries the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That is the qualification of the spiritual master. The spiritual master will never say, I am God. I can give you mercy. No, that is not a spiritual master. That is a bogus pretender. The spiritual master will say, I am a servant of God. I have brought his mercy. Please take it and be satisfied. This is the spiritual master's business. He is just like a mailman. When a mailman delivers you some large amount of money, it is not his own money. The money is sent by someone else, but he honestly delivers it. Sir, here is your money. Take it. So you become very much satisfied with him, although it is not his money he is giving you. When you are in need and you get money from your father or someone else brought by the mailman, you feel very much satisfaction. Similarly, we are all suffering in this blazing fire of material existence. The spiritual master brings the message from the Supreme Lord and delivers it to you. And if you kindly accept it, then you'll be satisfied. This is the business of the spiritual master. Samsara Dhavana Lidha Loka, Tanaya Karunya Dhana Dhana, Bhaktasya Kalyana Gunarnavasya, Vande Guroshi Charanadavindam. Thus, the spiritual master is offered obeisances. Sir, you have brought mercy from the Supreme Lord. Therefore, we are much obliged to you. You have come to deliver us, so we offer our respectful obeisances. That is the meaning of this verse. The first qualification of the spiritual master or guru is that he brings you the message to stop the blazing fire in your heart. This is the test.
Okay, so we'll break it there. Any questions about that? The idea of the spiritual master bringing the mercy to get free from the blazing fire of material existence. This is his first qualification. This is the first verse of the Gurvaṣṭakam.
Maharaj, just that analogy of the mailman, it reminds me, I think it was maybe in the Disciples course, where the same analogy was given, but it also talked about how the mailman doesn't have to be perfect, as long as the letter that he's delivering isn't opened or added to or subtracted from. So is it possible that a spiritual master, we talk about the qualities of a spiritual master, and like in the first verse of Nectar of Instruction, but is it possible for a spiritual master that doesn't have to be perfect, as long as he's not adulterating the message that he's carrying?
Yes and no. This is kind of a nuanced subject, so I will kind of talk about it on a couple of different levels. Generally speaking, we say that the spiritual master may not be perfect in the sense that he may not be directly seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead as he engages in pastimes with his pure devotees. That spiritual master may not be at that level to be able to see that. However, as we say, and as you just said, that if the spiritual master is simply presenting the message of Bhagavatam as has been originally described and not altering it in some way, then what he is saying is as good as the Supreme Personality of Godhead's own testimony. So therefore, we don't have to worry about that. However, we also do see that there are various qualifications, and in the Nectar of Instruction, Rupa Goswami mentions that there is Kanishta, Madhyam, and Uttam Adhikari. That the Uttam Adhikari is on the highest level, whereas the Madhyam can also be a spiritual master and can deliver the disciple. He is not on the same level as the Uttam, and we find that the Kanishta is, generally speaking, disqualified from being able to deliver the disciple. We also note that in Krishna consciousness, we could get our first inkling of Krishna consciousness from someone who is not even following Krishna consciousness themselves. And that is called sometimes a Vartma Pradarshaka guru. Someone who maybe even is breaking the regular principles. We could say the example there is, what was the name of that devotee?
The bartender?
No, there was a famous devotee who had a prostitute as his spiritual master. I'm trying to think of his name. It's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, where we discuss the fact that he was...
Pretty Woman?
What's that?
There was a movie, Pretty Woman. No.
Yeah, there was a... I can't remember his name right now, but he was attracted to a particular prostitute. And one day, it was like a hurricane outside. There was torrents of rain, and there was wind, and it was very dangerous. And he just had to see the prostitute that day. So he went out of his house, and he went across, and then he came to a river. And since there was such terrible weather, none of the boatmen were willing to take him across the river because they felt that they could lose their boat. So he couldn't get across, but he decided he would try to swim across. And he tried to swim across, and he was having trouble. And then he saw a log, so he grabbed hold of the log. And then later on, he looked and saw that it wasn't a log, it was a dead body. And he was swimming across the river using a dead body as a float. And then he got to the other side, and there was a high wall, and he had to get across the high wall, and somehow he scaled it, and he risked his life in so many ways, and he came to the prostitute. And that prostitute's name was Chintamani. So he went to Chintamani, and he said, "I'm here, I want to enjoy with you." And she took one look at him, He was beaten and bedraggled and whipped back and forth by the wind and the rain. And she said, if you had even 1/10 the determination to approach the Supreme Lord that you do to come to me for material enjoyment, you would be a pure devotee. So that's what the prostitute said to this devotee. And that's what was his light bulb moment. It just all went off in his head, and he realized, yes, she's right. And later on, he considers her his spiritual master. And so, in one sense, she is a spiritual master. Of course, it was not her who gave him initiation or gave him full instruction into Krishna consciousness, but she started the process. And a similar thing happened to me. Not that I had experience with a prostitute, but I had a friend who lived in San Francisco, and he certainly wasn't following the Regula principles. But one time he explained to me about Krishna consciousness and about the Bhagavad Gita and all these kind of things. I wasn't interested, but it made an impression on me. So this was how sometimes someone who isn't even following the regular principles can sometimes start a person's material life and a spiritual life. It can end his material life and start his spiritual life. As long as one is not adulterating the message or the process by their own material speculation, then yes, one can be delivered. At least one can make some progress. But if one actually wants to be delivered, then one needs continual help, and one needs continual spiritual guidance, and that can only be done from someone who is at least on the platform of Madhyam or Uttam. Only on those two platforms can someone guide you in the sense of a bona fide spiritual master. So yes and no. The question is kind of nuanced in that way, so I had to answer it in a more elaborate way.
That was Bilvamaṅgala Ṭhākura, right?
Right. That's the person that I was trying to remember, Bilvamaṅgala Ṭhākura. An interesting devotee. According to the Vedic literature, he lived for 800 years. So he lived for a very long time. But he had he made the statement that this Chintamani was his original spiritual master because she set him on the path of genuine spiritual life. And from that point on, he, perfected himself. Any final thoughts or questions before we wrap it in this evening?
I find Bilvamaṅgala Ṭhākura both, I guess, a little discouraging and encouraging at the same time, because, he went through so much, I think, wasn't it even after, anyway, he went through so much, and after going through so much, he had such a relapse,
Right.
And then, I just, I guess it's encouraging.
Yeah. This just goes to show us that if we're serious about chanting the holy name,
Progress.
we won't usually have to go through some of these really darker episodes to come to the process of Krishna consciousness fully. My internet is unstable, the computer is telling me.
Yeah, but you're coming through very clearly.
Okay. So I was just recently listening to a lecture by Ravindra Swarup, which is on ISKCONDesiretree.com. And he was discussing the chanting of the holy name, and he's describing that in the Vīśvanātha, in the very first verse of the Vīśvanātha, Cheto Darpanam Arjanam Bhava Mahadav Agni Nirvapanam Shreya Karavichandra Kavitarnam Vidyavadhu Jivanam Anandam Buddhivardhanam Pratipadam Purnamritasvadanam Sarvatma Snapanam Param Vijayate Sri Krishna Sankirtanam. In that first verse of the 8 stanzas that Lord Chaitanya wrote about the holy name, there are 8 glories or 8 effects of chanting the holy name. And in general, he's talking about the fact that if one is just serious about trying to hear the holy name, that the Supreme Lord will cleanse them from inside. It's usually when we are not so serious about chanting the holy name that we get slapped around by the material energy in a very serious way, and therefore have to go through some heavy-duty purification. That's a caveat to us, that if we are struggling with the holy name, hey, generally speaking, your life will not have to go through any really dark episodes. However, if you decide that you want to make offenses, or you decide that you're going to slack off on chanting, then, Kṛṣṇa will still preserve you and bring you around, but the process of being purified may not be so friendly. After all, that is why we should be very serious about chanting the holy name. If you kind of meditate on that a little bit before you start chanting the holy name, it might inspire you to be a little more diligent. That's a good thing to always remember. So Bilvamaṅgala Ṭhākura, of course, he became involved in spiritual life, and then he again became attracted by a woman and wanted to enjoy with her. But before they could come together, he asked her if she could lend him her hairpins, and he took the two hairpins that she gave him and he poked his eyes out with them. So that way he would not be slave to lust anymore, coming from being able to see. So for the last part of his life he was blind. We don't recommend this kind of process, but this is what happened to Bilvamaṅgala, and it's a caveat. And we can see this is probably what you were referring to, Gail. If one is serious about the holy name, then we won't necessarily have to go through an episode like that.
But it seemed like, by the time he was lusting after this woman, he had made like tremendous advancement, as I understand the story, and then he went from there to asking for this woman from her own husband.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's like, even most materialists wouldn't do that.
Right.
So I just never understood how he went from being from such a high level of attainment, he could have such a really low, blatant,
Yeah.
who would ask another man for his wife?
Right.
Right. I just didn't get that.
Well, we don't know how advanced he was before this second episode happened. We get the sense that he really was just not quite that advanced. Otherwise, such a thing would not have occurred. But it does goes to show how powerful and how entrenched sex desire is in the heart of every living entity, and we should never take it lightly or never think that we are somehow immune to it. That's why we have to be very serious about engaging in spiritual life. We have to be very serious at avoiding offenses. And of course, we have to also be serious about avoiding the near occasion of sin. We don't put ourselves in a position where we are going to be tempted. That's an important thing. All those three things have to be there. If we're chanting diligently, we're avoiding the near occasion of sin, and we're avoiding offenses, especially making offenses to Vaishnavas, then generally we won't be overcome by the senses, generally speaking. Someone may have, obviously if he was regularly seeing a prostitute, he must have been one of those guys that was really serious about sex, on a regular basis. So this throwback to his previous conditioning would have taken some time to overcome. Okay.
What were those three things? We should avoid the near occasions, and what the other two?
Chanting diligently, avoiding the near occasion of sin, and gosh, now I'm trying to remember what I just said.
Don't criticize the Vaishnavas.
Yeah, avoid offenses, right?
Okay.
Avoid the near occasion of sin, chant diligently, and avoid offenses, especially offenses to Vaishnavas.
What is that word you're saying? Near
Near occasion. That's
I'm
that's a
sorry.
Christian term, actually. Near and then occasion. So everybody knows that if you do certain things, you're going to risk. It's a little on the risky side, you know. So, you know, if you're a spiritual, someone who's trying to advance spiritually, there's certain kinds of places you probably wouldn't want to go because you might be tempted in some way or another. So, therefore, you don't take that risk. You know, a person who's in a renounced order generally doesn't travel alone with someone of the opposite sex. That's a risky situation, even if they don't have a relationship, even if whatever, you know. So these are all things that are a part of the idea of avoiding the near occasion of sin.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up, and I thank you all for attending, and we had a nice lively discussion tonight, a lot of different comments. I'll try to get some of these up on YouTube. I've been pretty good, but sometimes I get overwhelmed and I get behind and I don't get them up the next day, but sometimes I do. Depends on how things go. So all glories to Journey of Self-Discovery, all glories to Srila Prabhupada, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. And we will see you all again soon. I'll try to get the schedule up for next week tomorrow if I can at all pull it off. So thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare
Hare
Krishna.
Krishna.